Here's something almost nobody tells you about the worst chapters of your life. They don't end the way they began. The beginning is loud. Something breaks, someone leaves, a diagnosis lands. A life you trusted collapses in the space of an afternoon, and the noise of it fills every room you walk into for months afterward. But the ending is quiet. So quiet that most people walk straight through it without noticing they've crossed anything at all. You keep bracing for the next blow. You keep waiting for the storm to announce it's over, and it never does. It just gets quieter. And one ordinary morning you realize the thing you've been surviving isn't happening to you anymore. Carl Jung spent his life watching people go through this exact passage, and he noticed something that unsettled him. The people closest to a genuine ending were almost always the ones least able to feel it. They'd sit across from him, exhausted, describing a life that was clearly turning, clearly softening at the edges, clearly loosening its grip, and they'd insist that nothing had changed. They couldn't trust the quiet. They'd been braced for so long that stillness felt more threatening than the storm ever did. If that's where you are right now, worn down, half numb, still holding your breath for a blow that hasn't come in a while, then I want to walk you through what Jung understood about this moment. Because there's a real chance you're not still trapped in the hardest chapter of your life. There's a real chance you're standing at the exit, and the reason it doesn't feel like victory is that real exits from real suffering almost never do. Today I want to show you why the ending is quiet, why your nervous system refuses to believe it, and how to recognize the signs that you've already begun to walk out of something you thought would never end. Let's start with the thing Jung got that so few people do. He didn't believe the psyche worked on the same schedule as the conscious mind. When something breaks a person open, a loss, a betrayal, a slow unraveling of the life they'd built, the conscious mind experiences it as a single event with a beginning and, eventually, an end. But underneath that, in the deeper layers Jung spent his career mapping, the actual work of the crisis was happening on a completely different clock. And by the time the conscious mind finally caught up and started to feel like it might survive, the deeper self had often already moved on, already rebuilt, already turned towards something new. This creates a strange lag, a gap between when the hard chapter actually ends and when you're able to feel that it's ended. Jung saw this gap constantly, and he understood that it was one of the most confusing and painful stretches of the entire process, because during it, you are genuinely safe and genuinely free, and you cannot feel either of those things yet. You're standing in a room where the fire has been out for weeks, still smelling smoke that isn't there anymore. Think about what it's actually like to live through a long, hard season. Not a bad week, a real one. The kind that reorganizes who you are. In the thick of it, your whole system adapts to survival. You learn to sleep lightly. You learn to read every room before you enter it. You learn to expect the worst so the worst can't ambush you. Your body becomes an instrument tuned entirely to threat, and it gets very, very good at its job. That tuning is not a flaw. It's what carried you through. But here's what almost no one warns you about. That same tuning doesn't switch off just because the danger passed. It keeps scanning. It keeps bracing. It keeps you loyal to a threat that has already left the building. Jung would have recognized this immediately as the psyche's tendency to keep defending a position long after the battle has moved. The part of you that organized itself around survival doesn't get a memo when survival is no longer the assignment. It just keeps doing what it was built to do. And so you find yourself in this disorienting place where your life has quietly begun to heal, and your nervous system is still fighting a war that's already over. I want you to sit with how ordinary the exit actually looks, because this is where people miss it. You're not going to get a moment where the clouds part. There's no scene where someone tells you it's finally done and hands you your life back. What actually happens is smaller than that, and stranger. One day you laugh at something and it surprises you because you'd forgotten the sound. One day you make it to the afternoon before you remember to feel afraid. One day you cook a real meal instead of standing over the sink. One day someone asks how you're doing and you pause, genuinely pause, because the automatic answer doesn't quite fit anymore and you don't have a new one ready yet. Those moments don't feel like endings. They feel like nothing. They feel like accidents. And that's exactly why the hardest chapters of a life so often end without anyone noticing. Because we're all waiting for a door to slam, and the psyche prefers to close doors softly. Jung had a way of describing how the deepest problems in a person's life actually resolve, and it's worth hearing in his own words. He wrote that the greatest and most important problems of life are all, in a certain sense, insoluble. They can never be solved, he said, but only outgrown. Read that again slowly because it's the whole key to this. Outgrown. Not defeated, not fixed, not resolved in some clean confrontation where you finally win. You simply grow, quietly, into a version of yourself large enough that the thing which used to consume you no longer fits inside your life the way it did. That's why the exit is so quiet. You don't outgrow something with fireworks. A child doesn't announce the day they stop being afraid of the dark. They just, at some point, realize they haven't thought about it in a while. The fear didn't get slain, it got outgrown. And the outgrowing happened in the dark, in the quiet, in 1,000 nights you weren't keeping track of. The hardest chapter of your life is probably ending the same way. Not because you conquered it in a single decisive act, but because somewhere in all those unremarkable days, you became someone the suffering can no longer fully reach. And that transformation is so gradual, so undramatic, that your conscious mind, still braced, still scanning, still loyal to the old threat, hasn't been able to register it yet. Let me show you why the mind resists this so hard. Because it's not stubbornness and it's not weakness. It's something much more understandable. When you've been through something genuinely difficult, hope becomes dangerous. Somewhere along the way, you probably let yourself believe it was getting better, and then it got worse. And that particular fall, the fall from a moment of hope back into the pain, hurt more than the pain itself ever did. So you learned. You learned not to trust the good stretches. You learned to treat every calm day as the eye of the storm rather than the end of it. You learned that bracing hurt less than hoping. Jung understood that this defensive refusal to hope was itself a wound that needed healing, and he was gentle about it. He didn't think people clung to pessimism because they were broken. He thought they clung to it because at some point it had protected them. The problem is that a protection which once saved you can, if you carry it too far past its usefulness, become the very thing that keeps you locked inside a chapter that's trying to release you. So here's the uncomfortable possibility I want you to consider. It's not that you're still in the hardest part. It's that you've grown so used to being in the hardest part that you can't yet let yourself feel the exit. The suffering became familiar, and familiar, even when it's painful, has a gravity to it. The human psyche will cling to a known agony over an unknown peace more often than we'd like to admit, because at least the known agony has a shape you understand. Peace, after a long war, feels formless. It feels like a trick. It feels like the ground might give way any second. Picture someone who spent 3 years caring for a dying parent. Every day organized around the crisis, every phone call a possible emergency, every night interrupted. And then the parent passes, and after the first wave of grief, something eerie sets in. The person doesn't know what to do with a Tuesday. They keep reaching for the phone that no longer needs to be answered. They wake at 3 a.m. out of habit, listening for a sound that isn't coming. Their whole life had been built around a hard chapter, and now that the chapter has closed, they feel not relief but a kind of vertigo. Who am I, they think, If I'm not the one holding this together, that vertigo is the sound of an exit. It doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like losing your footing. But Jung would tell you that the disorientation you feel when a hard season lifts is not a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that the structure the suffering built inside you is finally coming down. And for a while, before the new structure forms, you're going to feel like you're standing on nothing at all. Now here's where it gets more specific, because Jung didn't leave this at the level of poetry. He identified real markers, real signs in the psyche and in daily life that tell you a difficult chapter is genuinely closing, not just pausing. And the first one is almost cruel in how it disguises itself, because it looks exactly like emptiness. When a hard chapter is truly ending, one of the first things you'll notice is that the intensity drains out of everything, including the things that used to comfort you. The pain gets quieter, yes, but so does the relief you used to feel in small pleasures. The fantasies you used to escape into lose their pull. Even the anger, that clean, energizing anger that kept you upright through the worst of it, starts to feel like too much effort to sustain. People experience this and panic. They think, I've gone numb. I've lost the ability to feel. The suffering broke something in me. And they mourn the numbness as if it were a new wound. But Jung saw this differently. He understood that when the psyche finishes a major piece of work, it withdraws its energy from the whole battlefield, not just from the pain, but from everything that was mobilized to fight the pain. The intensity fades on both sides because the war is genuinely over, and your system, wisely, is standing down. What feels like numbness is often the exhausted quiet of a soldier who has finally been allowed to lower the weapon. It isn't the absence of feeling. It's the strange, flat peace that comes right before feeling reorganizes itself into something new. The second marker is subtler and, honestly, more beautiful. When you're truly exiting a hard chapter, you start to be able to tell the story of it without falling back into it. In the depths of a crisis, you can't narrate it. You're inside it, drowning in it, and any attempt to describe it just pulls you under again. But there comes a point where you can say the words, describe what happened, name what it cost you, and remain standing. The memory still aches. It might always ache. But it no longer has the power to reach up and drag you back down into the version of yourself you were when it was happening. Jung placed enormous weight on this capacity, because for him, the ability to hold your own story consciously, to look at it without being possessed by it, was one of the surest signs that a piece of unconscious material had finally been integrated. As long as the pain owned you, you couldn't look at it. When you can finally look at it, steadily, it means you've become larger than it. And that, again, is what he meant by outgrowing. You didn't erase the hard chapter. You grew a self big enough to contain it. There's a specific texture to this I want to name, because you might be feeling it right now without having words for it. It's the moment when your suffering starts to feel like something that happened rather than something that's happening. That shift in tense, from present to past, is one of the quietest and most profound turns a human being can make, and it almost always slips by unremarked. One day, the story of your hardest year lives in the past tense in your own mind, and you don't throw a party. You just notice, faintly, that the wound has become a scar, and scars, unlike wounds, don't bleed when the weather changes. Let me give you the third marker, and this one tends to catch people off guard because it can look like a problem. When a hard chapter is closing, you often start to feel a restlessness that has no clear object. A sense that you should be doing something, moving somewhere, starting something, but you don't know what. It's vague and irritating, and it makes you feel ungrateful because logically things are calmer now, and you think you should just be relieved. Instead, you feel this itch, this forward pull, this energy that has nowhere to go. Jung would have recognized that restlessness instantly. It's the life force returning. For months or years, all your energy was conscripted into survival. There was nothing left over for wanting, for building, for reaching toward anything. And now that the emergency is passing, that energy is coming back online, and it doesn't have a job yet, so it churns. It feels like anxiety, but it's actually closer to spring, the same restless pressure a seed feels underground when the temperature shifts, and something ancient in it says, now, 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 without yet knowing what for. If you've been feeling that formless pull lately, that sense that something in you is stirring toward a future you can't see the shape of yet, I want you to consider that it might not be anxiety at all. It might be the first movement of a self that's done surviving and is getting ready to live again. And if part of what you're feeling is the need to understand where you actually are in all of this, to make sense of the quiet, to tell the difference between the chapter ending and yourself just going numb, that's exactly the kind of inward turn Jung spent his whole life pointing people toward. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for precisely this stretch of the road, the disorienting quiet at the end of something hard, when you're trying to find your footing on ground that's still settling. If that's where you are, the link is below. But stay with me, because the next part is where this really turns. Because here's the turn. Everything I've described so far, the quiet, the lag, the numbness that's really rest, the restlessness that's really life returning, all of it assumes something you might not have let yourself believe. It assumes the hard chapter is actually ending. And I know that a part of you, the part that got burned by hope before, is reading all of this and thinking, but what if it isn't? What if I let myself believe this and I'm wrong? What if I relax and it comes back? I want to speak to that part directly, because Jung had something to say to it that changed how I understand this entire passage. He didn't believe you had to be certain the chapter was ending in order to begin living again. In fact, he thought the demand for certainty was itself a symptom of the wound, the survival mind insisting on guarantees before it will let you stand down. But life doesn't offer guarantees, and it never did, not before the hard chapter and not after it. The person you were before all this happened wasn't safe either. They just didn't know it yet. What changed isn't that the world became dangerous. What changed is that you found out. And here's the thing Jung understood about that discovery. You can't unknow it, and you shouldn't want to. The knowledge that life can break you is not a curse, it's an initiation. The people who've never been through a genuinely hard chapter carry a kind of innocence that looks like peace, but is actually just untested. They haven't found out what they're made of because nothing has ever required them to. You know, whatever else the hardest chapter of your life took from you, it gave you this, proof, carved into your own body, that you can endure what you were certain would destroy you. And you did endure it. You're here. The very fact that you're worried about whether you can survive it again is proof that some part of you already suspects you've survived it once. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, and he meant it as literally as it sounds. The pain wasn't a detour on the way to who you're becoming. The pain was the road. Every difficult chapter that reorganizes a person is, in his framework, a forced expansion of consciousness, a demand that you become aware of things you'd rather not know, capacities you didn't want to need, depths you'd have preferred to leave unexplored. It hurts because growth of that magnitude always hurts. But you don't get to become who you're becoming without walking exactly the road you walked. So let me reframe the entire question. You've been asking, is it really over? Can I trust it? What if it comes back? Those are the survival mind's questions, and they can't be answered because they demand a certainty that doesn't exist. But there's a different question underneath them, the one Jung would actually want you to sit with. Not, is the danger gone, but have I become someone who can meet whatever comes? And to that question, the honest answer, if you look at the evidence of your own survival, is almost certainly yes. You already have. The proof is that you're still standing in a life you were sure would end you. Let me slow down here and talk about what actually formed in you during the hard chapter, because this is the part people almost never get to see, and it's the most important thing I'll say. When you're inside a difficult season, it feels purely subtractive. It takes and takes. It takes your energy, your sleep, your relationships, your sense of who you are, your faith that things work out. You experience it as loss, day after day, and you're not wrong, it is loss. But Jung noticed that underneath the visible subtraction, something was quietly being built. And the building was invisible precisely because it was happening in the same dark where everything else was being torn down. Think about how a bone heals after it breaks. At the site of the fracture, the body lays down new material. And if you've ever seen an X-ray of a well-healed break, you know that the spot where the bone knit itself back together is often thicker, denser, stronger than the bone around it. It doesn't heal back to what it was. It heals into something more able to withstand pressure. Jung believed the psyche did something similar, that the places where we break, if we survive the breaking, become the places where we're strongest. The suffering deposits something. A density, a depth, a capacity that wasn't there before and couldn't have gotten there any other way. This is why so many people, looking back years later on the hardest chapter of their lives, say the thing that sounds impossible from the inside, that they wouldn't trade it. Not because they enjoyed it, nobody enjoys it, but because they can see, from the far side, that the person they became was forged in exactly that fire, and they've come to love that person too much to wish the fire away. You can't see this yet if you're still in the quiet exit, still braced, still half convinced you're numb rather than resting. But it's forming. The density is already in you. You laid it down in every night you thought you couldn't make it through and made it through anyway. Let me tell you what this looks like in the texture of an actual life, because I don't want this to stay abstract. Picture a woman in her 40s who spent 2 years dismantling a marriage that everyone, including her, had believed was permanent. The house sold, the friends split into camps, the children shuttled between 2 homes with 2 sets of rules, and every handoff was a small grief. For a long time, she was purely in survival, getting through the days, managing the logistics, holding herself together with a discipline that left nothing over for anything else. If you'd asked her during that stretch how she was, she'd have said honestly that she was disappearing. And then, slowly, without any single moment she could point to, the ground began to change. She noticed one evening that she'd spent an hour reading a novel and hadn't thought about the divorce once. She noticed that she'd started humming in the kitchen. She noticed that when her ex called with some new complication, it landed on her differently, still annoying but no longer catastrophic, more like weather than like a wound. And here's the part Jung would have found most telling. She didn't feel happy about any of this. She felt suspicious of it. She kept waiting for the crash. She'd been through so many false dawns that she couldn't let herself trust a real one. That suspicion is the last stronghold of the hard chapter. It's the place where the old suffering makes its final stand. Not in the pain itself, which is largely past, but in the refusal to believe the pain is past. And I want to be very clear about something, because this is where people get stuck for years longer than they need to. You can exit the hardest chapter of your life and continue to suffer inside it purely out of the habit of expecting it. The event ends. The bracing doesn't. And the bracing, if you don't recognize it for what it is, will keep you locked in a prison whose door has been standing open for a long time. Jung's whole approach to this was about making the unconscious conscious, bringing into the light of awareness the patterns that were running your life from the dark. And this is precisely one of those patterns. The bracing operates below your notice. You don't decide to expect the worst, you just do, automatically. The way you don't decide your heart should beat faster when you hear a loud noise. But the moment you can see the bracing, the moment you can catch yourself in the act and say, "Ah, there it is," that's the old survival mind still scanning for a threat that's already gone. Something shifts. You don't have to force it to stop. You just have to see it clearly. Consciousness, Jung believed, is itself a kind of solvent. The pattern you can observe loses its grip on you simply by being observed. So try this right now as you're listening. Notice whether some part of you is bracing even in this moment. Notice whether, as I describe the possibility that your hard chapter is ending, there's a reflexive tightening, a voice that says, "Don't get your hopes up," a refusal to let the good news in. That tightening isn't the truth about your situation. It's the truth about your training. You were trained by suffering to distrust relief, and that training was earned honestly, and it also isn't serving you anymore. You're allowed to notice it and set it down. Not force it away, just notice and let the noticing do its slow work. There's a deeper layer to why the exit stays hidden, and it goes to the strangest thing about the human psyche. We build our identities around our struggles. This isn't a character flaw, it's how meaning works. When you go through something hard for long enough, it stops being something that's happening to you and becomes part of who you are. The one who's struggling, the one who's healing, the one who's fighting the illness, grieving the loss, surviving the fallout, holding it all together against impossible odds. That identity is often the only stable thing you have during the chaos, and you grip it like a railing. But then the chapter starts to end, and the identity that was built to survive it has no obvious reason to exist anymore. And here's the quiet tragedy Jung watched play out over and over. People would unconsciously prolong their suffering or manufacture new versions of it because they didn't know who they'd be without it. The struggle had become the self. To leave the struggle behind felt like a kind of death, not a physical death, but the death of the person the hard chapter had made them into. And the psyche, faced with a choice between the pain of a known identity and the terror of an unknown one, will often choose the pain. Jung had a word for the process of moving through exactly this kind of death and rebirth. He called it individuation, the slow becoming of who you actually are, underneath the roles and defenses and survival identities you accumulated along the way. And he understood that individuation always involves a series of small deaths, each one a version of yourself that has to be released so a truer version can emerge. The version of you that the hard chapter created, the survivor, the fighter, the one who held on, served you magnificently. And now, at the exit, that version is being asked to loosen its grip, not because it failed, but because it succeeded and its job is done. That's an unbelievably hard thing to do, to let go of the self that saved you, to thank the survivor and tell it that it can rest now. Because there's a loyalty there, a real one. That part of you fought like hell to keep you alive, and turning toward a lighter, freer future can feel like a betrayal of everything it did. But it isn't a betrayal. It's the whole point. The survivor didn't fight so you could stay a survivor forever. It fought so you could eventually put the fighting down and become something the fight never had room for. Let me name a few more of the quiet signs, because I want you to have a real map, not just a feeling. One of the surest signs that you're exiting a hard chapter is that you start caring about small, ordinary things again. the quality of the light in the afternoon, whether the plant on the windowsill needs water, what you might make for dinner not out of necessity, but out of a flicker of actual interest. During the worst of a hard season, all of that disappears. The small textures of life get burned off because you have no attention to spare for anything but the crisis. When they come back quietly, as small preferences and minor pleasures, and it's easy to overlook them entirely. But the return of the small things is one of the most reliable signals the deep psyche gives that it's turning back toward life. Notice when you start caring about tiny things again. That caring is enormous. Another sign is that time changes shape. Inside a hard chapter, time is strange. It can crawl unbearably in the moment and yet vanish in retrospect. Whole months gone with nothing to show for them but survival. As the chapter closes, time starts to feel more like time again. You begin to think in terms of next week, next month, next year. You begin to have a future again, tentatively, and it stops feeling either infinite or impossible. When you catch yourself making a plan for something more than a few days out and actually feeling something other than dread about it, pay attention. The return of a livable future is the exit revealing itself. And here's one more, maybe the most tender of all. You start to feel compassion for the version of yourself who went through it. In the thick of a hard chapter, most people are brutal toward themselves. They judge their own reactions, criticize themselves for not coping better, measure themselves against an impossible standard of how they think they should be handling it. That harshness is a survival mechanism too, a way of trying to whip yourself into being strong enough. But when the chapter genuinely begins to close, something softens, and you find yourself looking back at who you were during the worst of it, not with judgment, but with something almost like tenderness. My God, you think, look at what I was carrying. Look at how hard it was, and I kept going. When that tenderness arrives, it means you've stepped far enough outside the suffering to finally see the person who endured it, and to love them. That's not a small thing. In Jung's world, that turn toward self-compassion was one of the clearest signs that integration had actually occurred. I want to address the fear directly now, because I know it's still sitting there, the fear that comes back. What if the hard chapter isn't ending? What if this is just a lull? What if I let myself believe it and get destroyed again? Let me tell you what Jung would say, and it's not a reassurance, because reassurance is exactly what the survival mind wants and can never be satisfied by. It's something better than reassurance. He would say that even if difficulty comes again, and at some point, in some form, it will, because you're alive, and that's the price of admission. You will not meet it as the same person who met the last one. You've been remade. The capacities you built in this chapter don't evaporate when the chapter ends. They become part of your permanent equipment. The depth you found, the endurance you discovered, the version of yourself that can hold a story without drowning in it. None of that gets taken back. So the fear assumes something false. It assumes that if the difficulty returns, you'll be as unprepared and as fragile as you were the first time. But you won't. You can't be. You've already changed. The next hard chapter, if it comes, will find a different person waiting than the one this chapter found. And that person is stronger than you currently believe, because you're judging your strength from inside the fog of a season that isn't even fully yours anymore. There's a phrase Jung used that I keep returning to. He said that who looks outside dreams, and who looks inside awakes. During the hard chapter, almost all your attention is forced outward, onto the threat, the crisis, the endless problems demanding to be managed. You have to look outside. That's survival. But the exit from a hard chapter is fundamentally an inward turn. It's the moment when the crisis has quieted enough that you can finally look back inside yourself and see what's there now. and what's there is not the same person who entered. The looking inside, the awakening Jung talked about, is available precisely at this threshold, in the quiet, in the lull, in the strange stillness that you've been mistaking for numbness. The quiet isn't empty. It's the condition under which you can finally see yourself again. Let me talk about what to actually do with this, because I don't want to leave you with only understanding. Understanding is a start, but Jung was intensely practical about the fact that insight alone doesn't complete the work. So here is what the exit asks of you, and it's less than you think, and also harder. The first thing is simply to let yourself notice the evidence. You've spent so long tracking threat that you've built no muscle for tracking recovery. So start deliberately to notice the small returns. The laugh that surprised you, the afternoon you forgot to be afraid, the plan you made for next month without dread, the tenderness you felt for your past self. You don't have to celebrate them. You don't have to trust them yet. Just notice them, name them, let them register. You're teaching a system that only knows how to scan for danger that there's other data available now. This is slow work, and it feels almost silly at first, but it's how the survival mind gets slowly re-educated into believing what your deeper self already knows. The second thing is to resist the urge to fill the quiet immediately. When the restlessness comes, that formless forward pull I described, the temptation will be to grab the first available thing to pour it into. A new project, a new relationship, a new crisis if nothing else presents itself. Because for a mind trained on emergency, even a new emergency can feel more comfortable than an open, undefined peace. Jung would warn you against this. The quiet at the end of a hard chapter is not empty space to be filled as fast as possible. It's fertile ground, and things that are planted too quickly in it, out of anxiety rather than genuine desire, tend not to be the things you actually want to grow. Let the quiet stay quiet a little longer than is comfortable. Let it show you what actually wants to emerge, rather than forcing something into it just to make the openness stop. The third thing is to grieve, if you need to, the version of yourself you're leaving behind. This sounds strange, grieving the survivor, grieving the identity the suffering built, but it matters. That self carried you. It deserves acknowledgement before it's released. You might find it helpful to actually thank it, in whatever way feels real to you. To speak to the part of you that white-knuckled its way through and tell it that it did enough, that it can rest, that you've got it from here. This isn't sentimental. It's the psychological work of a genuine transition, honoring what served you so you can let it evolve into what comes next. And the fourth thing, the hardest, is to allow yourself to want again. Because wanting is dangerous for anyone who's been hurt. To want something is to risk not getting it, to open yourself to disappointment, to make yourself vulnerable in exactly the way the hard chapter taught you never to be again. During survival, you shut wanting down. You narrowed your life to needs, because needs you could manage, and wants would only hurt. But you can't live a full life on needs alone. At some point, the exit from a hard chapter requires you to let desire come back online, to let yourself reach toward something not because you have to, but because you genuinely want it. That reaching will feel exposed and unfamiliar, and probably a little terrifying. And it's also the surest sign that you're not just surviving anymore. You're beginning, quietly, to live. I keep coming back to how undramatic all of this is, because I think the lack of drama is precisely what makes it so hard to trust. We're taught by every story we've ever heard that transformation is supposed to be visible. The hero's triumphant return, the moment of victory, the clear before and after. But the actual exit from the hardest chapter of a real human life looks like almost nothing. It looks like a Tuesday. It looks like a person standing at a sink, realizing they haven't cried in a week, not sure whether that's healing or just exhaustion, deciding, tentatively, revocably, to believe it might be healing. There are no witnesses, there's no ceremony. There's just you, quietly, becoming someone the suffering can no longer fully claim. Jung believed that this quiet was appropriate, that the deepest changes in a person should happen quietly, because they happen at a level far below the noise of ordinary life. The loud things are usually the surface things. The real transformation goes on underneath, in the dark, in the silence, on a timeline that has nothing to do with how quickly we wish it would move. And by the time it surfaces into consciousness, by the time you can finally feel it, it's often already mostly done. The exit you're straining to see in the distance may in fact be behind you. You may already be standing on the other side of a threshold you never felt yourself cross. Let me say something to the part of you that's kept score of everything this chapter cost. Because it did cost. I'm not going to pretend it didn't, or wrap it in some neat lesson that makes the price seem worth it in a way that erases the pain. Some of what the hard chapter took, you don't get back. Some losses are permanent. Some people don't return. Some versions of the life you thought you'd have are simply gone, and no amount of growth makes that not a real grief. Jung was never one to sugarcoat this. He didn't believe suffering was a gift with a bow on it. He believed suffering was suffering, full stop, and that the meaning we find in it afterward doesn't cancel the pain. It just refuses to let the pain be the only thing that's true. So I won't tell you it was worth it. That's not mine to say, and it may not even be true. What I'll tell you instead is that the cost is already paid. You've already spent what this chapter demanded. The bill is settled. And the question now isn't whether it was worth it. That's a question you may not be able to answer for years, if ever. The question now is what you're going to do with the self that survived the paying. Because that self is real, and it's here, and it's more capable than the frightened, exhausted part of you can currently perceive. The person who's listening to this, worn down, half-braced, unsure whether to trust the quiet, that person made it through. Whatever else is uncertain, that is not. If you've been feeling the pull to actually turn inward and take stock of who you've become, to sit with the quiet instead of rushing to fill it, to understand where you truly are in your own story now that the loudest part is past, that inward turn is the whole work of this threshold, and it's exactly what our guide True Self-Discovery was made for. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's approach to self-understanding, built to help you meet the version of yourself that emerged from the hard chapter and figure out, honestly and without pressure, what wants to come next. It won't rush you through the quiet. It'll help you listen to it. The link is right below if that feels like something you need right now. I want to close by returning to where we started, because I think you're in a different place now than you were when I began, even if nothing outside you has changed. We started with the quiet, the strange, unsettling stillness at the end of a hard season that everyone braces against and almost no one recognizes as an ending. And I want you to hear what that quiet actually is, now that we've walked all the way through it together. The quiet is not the eye of the storm. It's not a trick, not a lull, not the calm before another blow. The quiet is what the far side of survival actually sounds like. It's undramatic because real endings are undramatic. It's unsettling because you've forgotten, in the long noise of the hard chapter, that peace even has a texture. And it feels like numbness because your system is finally, after all this time, being allowed to rest. You've been listening so hard for the sound of a door slamming that you missed the sound of one closing softly behind you. It's already shut. You're already on the other side. And the person standing there, in the new quiet, is someone the last chapter could not have imagined. Someone forged in exactly the fire they were sure would end them, standing in a stillness they were sure they'd never reach. You don't have to trust it all at once. The survival mind won't let you, and that's all right. It earned its caution honestly. but you can begin to notice the evidence. You can begin to let the small returns register. You can begin to feel the tenderness for who you were and the strange, formless pull toward who you're becoming. You can let the quiet be quiet a little longer than is comfortable, and let it show you, in its own time, what wants to grow in the ground the hard chapter cleared. The greatest problems of a life, Jung said, are never solved, only outgrown. And you have grown. Quietly, invisibly, night after night when you were certain you were only surviving, you were also becoming larger than the thing that was trying to consume you. The hardest chapter of your life is ending. Not with fireworks, not with a moment you can point to and name. It's ending the way these things always end for the people who actually make it through. Quietly, gradually, almost secretly, in a self that grew when no one, including you, was watching. Let it end. You've done the impossible part already. All that's left is to let yourself walk, slowly, into the quiet on the other side, and to trust, a little more each ordinary day, that the ground beneath you is going to hold. If you haven't yet, take a look at our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, made for exactly this stretch of the journey, the quiet after the hardest part, when you're learning to trust the ground again and figure out who you've become. Not to rush you out of the quiet, but to walk with you through it. The link is right below.